Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jez Anderson. I'm the head of consulting here at Kineo, and I'm presenting today with my colleague Pete Smith, who I shall let introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yep, I'm Pete Smith. I am technical team lead for Kineo.
So thank you for joining us. So for the next period of time, 35, 40 minutes maybe, we're going to just quickly have a look at analytics for digital learning. And this is a little bit thinking around some of the work that we've been doing recently, looking at data, looking at how we use data, looking at some of the issues that are attached to it, and most importantly, a solution or a part solution to starting to use data in a more effective, potentially more effective way. So just as a quick icebreaker, so hello to everybody else. If you just want to pop into the chat, where are you and what's the weather doing outside? Very British question, I know, but I am, at the end of the day, I am British. I'm in Brighton and it's grey and horrible. Although looking out the window, which I am in an enclosed room with a skylight, it seems to be sunny now, so that's quite good. So let's move on and let's quickly have a look at get into the detail of our webinar. So the context for this, and it comes from when we started thinking around data in the last few years. Increasingly, it was an issue that was becoming more and more important for our clients, wanting to be able to understand data that's available to them, to be able to identify and analyze that data in an effective and quick way, and to be able to use that data to create insight to help support their activities. And so what we did is we spent some time looking at what's going on within the broader market, as most people have been doing. So the first few slides of the deck are really about context, a little bit about context around learning in general, using some of our own data, but also using some of the data that's come from other sources, to give us that background as to why this is important, and sort of hopefully start to think about, well, how can we use this new approach to managing data, or an approach to managing data, to have a positive impact on the work that we do with learning and development. So that's a little bit of context. Thank you for the weather. I'm pleased to see that it is grey in Manchester, as both Pete and I are from that neck of the woods, Tim. So some things don't ever change, it seems. And the weather is Scottish in Edinburgh. That's always good as well. So thank you for that. During the session, if there's any questions that you want to pose to either to ourselves or to the rest of the group, do feel free to use the chat. We'll be monitoring it as we go. We've embedded a couple of questions in here as well, which we might ask you to just to pop your experience and your thoughts down as well. So again, thank you for joining us, and hopefully the next few slides will provide some interesting information for you. So backdrop, global spending. I think most people have probably seen these statistics before, and it's very positive on one basis, that we appear to be, as a global market, increasing the amount of money that we're spending on learning and development. According to Statista, sorry, apologies about that, which has been quoted by Towards Maturity in their latest report, although money is going into it, this isn't being reflected in the level of impact that money is returning. So whilst we're all searching for ROI, the holy grail of data, and how do we get to level 4 if you're in a Kirkpatrick world, the reality of it is how more importantly potentially is how do we use the investment that we've got now effectively? How do we make sure that the money that we're spending on our learning is hitting the mark at a learner level? So although ROI and looking at those higher level impact insight is very important, equally is important to us understand what we can control. And it's, a phrase I often use, nicked from the world of athletics, is it's control the controllables. It's what exists that we have, that we can influence, and what can we do about that, which will positively have an impact. Just checking on sound. I just had a note to say sound has dropped out for Sean. Has anybody else had sound dropouts? I'm going to move on if that's the case. So, interesting perspective. So if we think about the amount that has been spent on learning of late. So if we think about 2019, this is in I think it's in millions. I'm gonna go with billions. Actually, that feels a lot. So it's probably millions. Apologies for that. I should know exactly what the figure is. But if we think about what the average score, now the TMI score for those people that don't know what this is what was formerly known as the Towards Maturity Index. So Towards Maturity are a UK-based organisation, for those that haven't come across them before, who have spent the last many years, last 10 plus years, looking at the L&D world, looking at, in particular, at learning technologies, and asking questions of the industry in terms of the sorts of activities that people are doing and looking at the impact that that's having. They've used what they call, or what was called, the Towards Maturity Index, now called the Emerald Works Inventory, as Towards Maturity have been absorbed into the Emerald Works. And it looks at 96 strategic behaviours that correlate specifically to profitability, productivity, transformation, and growth. So we've got 4 clear metric areas. It's a 0 to 100 scale, and they have been revisiting this on an annual basis to ensure that it's got statistical validity. And as you can see, over a period of time, that score is steadily dropping, which ultimately means we're not getting something right. We've got increasing levels of investment, but potentially decreasing levels of impact. So what are we doing wrong? What are the things that we're not focusing on? How this relates to those 4 key areas specifically? It's down 1.43% in terms of growth, down on profitability by 1.37%, transformation and the ability to lead change down 1.29%, and productivity 1.61%. So their statistics are clearly giving us some strong indications that our focus may not be right. We might not be clearly drawing correlation between our input and our output, which may be a matter of actually, are we choosing the right topics? Equally, it could well be a matter of, are we getting the learning right? Are we actually producing the right level of learning? Obviously, at Kineo, we're very much about focusing on effective learning design and thinking around how do we use learning design to support effective learning and effective impact. So what we're trying to do, and we're using what we call Didactics, which Pete will be talking about in a short period of time, is to look at trying to help solve this problem. It's trying to give learning and development leaders an opportunity to look at the impact that the learning designs through e-learning that they're creating is having on performance of an organisation. We're never going to get to ROI in this looking at a single set of data like that. However, we are looking at how effectively a piece of e-learning can have a positive impact, or is having a positive impact on learner engagement, on aspects of actual learning that an individual is demonstrating. And we're going to use we'll show you how we're using learner statistics and learner data that is occurring naturally to generate that insight. Then we'll also explore how then we use that insight to start to inform effective learning design. And then we can start to think about how do we utilize that and to create different approaches that are going to work with different groups or in different demographics in different ways. So as we all know, data is an issue. Data has been a big, it's been the driving conversation for several years now. All the key pundits have been talking about it. All the key thought leaders are talking about it. So what we're trying to do is come up with a practical solution to start to help provide some insight around that. Our clients are really no massive difference to anybody else, so these may well resonate with yourself. 70% of clients clearly state that the impact support has on learning is very important. So it's a bit of a no-brainer. Of course, understanding how their learning impacts is important, but how do we do it? And that's probably one of the key questions. 50% of our respondents admitted they didn't use the data they generated. So they may well be creating data sets, and they may well be creating information that's there, and they may well be drawing that data back, but they're just not using it, or they don't know how to use it. So we're trying to come up with something which provides people with an opportunity to cut out that analytics part of it and provide some useful and natural insight, because at the end of the day, we're not data analysts. And I think for me, there's a big question around L&D and saying, well, how can we as learning and development expect overnight to become data analysts? I'm not going to. So yes, okay, it may well be an emerging capability that L&D needs to think about and either develop or bring into our organizations. The reality of it is our first step is what data do we have and how can we use it enough to be able to start to provide some novel and valuable insight. 85% of the respondents said that they carry out some formal evaluation, and they do that activity now. Majority of that is at level 1. So it's immediate response, looking at immediate learner feedback. There's very little that goes on above level 1. Pete, were you gonna?
I was just going to point out that we've had a comment in from Viv, who says, not disagreeing with the conclusion that increase in spend is not moving the dial noticeably, but arguably the TMI going down on average reflects an increasing number of smaller, less mature organisations joining the survey, and therefore bringing the overall average down.
That's an interesting point, but I'd need to dig into the data more to understand that. But I suspect, yes, I mean that could well be the issue. I think towards maturity, we may well argue that it is calibrated to reflect an overview, and that has been balanced out of it. But again, I wouldn't know without asking them. But I think it's an interesting point. And like any data, like any statistics, they all have to be taken carefully and put into context. And I think that's a really, so if we take a broader point from what Viv says, actually, what statistics and lies, or whatever the comment was, it's about how do we carefully use data to inform our arguments in a way which makes sure that what we're actually talking about is reasoned and is valid, and can be clearly evidenced against some input and some output. And isn't just there because vanity data. It's just about focusing on some metrics that aren't really that important or necessary. 70% of the greatest use of data generated to inform learning design, but the greatest majority want to use data better to demonstrate the impact. So yes, we know that we're using it to inform what we do, and what we're proposing is doing more of that. It does get harder the moment we start to think about looking at broader impact, and we're doing some work on that with some of our clients and some of our partners, which we can explain a little bit after. But it's when we start to get into multi-source data, corroborating data sets, and then how do we process that in an automatic way without the need for big data analyst structures. It's all well, some of our clients have that. They have data analysts that they can tap into and use, but the majority don't. So it's trying to find a solution and find a way which enables people to use the data that exists in a way which is helpful and usable for them without getting tied up in knots about the data itself. And the final stat, 80% of those surveys reported they don't have the skills and experience necessary. So it sort of underpins this thing that actually, although it's important, we all recognize the importance of it. The reality of it is that as L&D, we're not skilled to do it. We're not capable of, we haven't been developed the capability to do that. Not to say we can't, but it would be something which we would have to develop and grow. And that's some of the backdrop that we're working with as an organization. So We also asked some of our key clients what their approaches were, and they offered, some are focused on top down, some are focused on bottom up, which is more successful. So if we think about top down, it's those that are looking for that level 4 type evaluation, and those that are looking at bottom up are starting from a learner experience perspective, looking, level 1 moving upwards. Which is more successful? It's hard to say. I think from our experience talking to our clients, those that are working from the bottom up actually find that they're getting data which is more usable. Those that are working from a top down, it's harder because it becomes that trying to get granular sets of data against very granular metrics is a difficult process, from identifying what the metrics are right at the start through to understanding what data sources are going to give you an insight against those metrics to see what levers you're pulling and how that has an impact. It's not impossible, but it becomes probably something which at this stage, and certainly from where we're sitting, if you try to automate that and try to make that a non-manual process without some more data and analytical work going into it, is quite a challenge. As I hand over to Pete, who's going to talk you through Didactics, which is our in some ways our solution to this, which has helped us answer some of these questions. We're just going to put a couple of questions out there. So, what kind of data insights are you using, if you are using any, to try and measure impact? So please feel free to pop those into the chat if you've got an answer to that, or if you've got any further questions. So I'm going to hand over to Pete, who will walk us through Didactics, what it is, how it works, and some of the conditions that are necessary for making it effective. So Pete, over to you.
Cool, thank you, Jez. So yeah, this isn't a solution to everything that Jez has been talking about, because as Jez very well summarised there, that's the whole data question, the whole picture is very broad, and it involves integration to some level with business data. So this actually is just picking. It's an answer really to a small subset of the entire broader data question, and it's one which is very close to my interest, because it's an attempt to solve a frustration that I've had for the last 12 years or so in the world of e-learning, which is just how incredibly data starved we are in the learning content world. So when we create bespoke content, most of the courses that we create are still built for SCORM. A lot of them are still built for SCORM 1.2, and ultimately they go and live on the client's learning management system, where we don't actually see any information whatsoever about how they're being used, who's using them, and whether they're really working, whether they're providing a good, effective learning intervention. And in the world of web, where on the marketing side of the business, obviously Google Analytics and other analytics packages are central and core to everything which is done in that web world. With e-learning, we don't have those sorts of analytics data. So this is really an attempt to solve it, and we've come up with a product which is called Didactics. In the beginning, we actually used Google Analytics to try and get a bit more information about how many people were accessing courses, how long they were spending throughout it, whether certain sections of the course that they're dropping out from, what devices people are using, because all of those questions the answers to those will determine how we would build the next course that we build for that client, or future iterations of that course. So they seem like important questions to answer. Google Analytics, so, has a lot of gaps from an e-learning perspective. In many ways, if you're building a website, you've got a much simpler, easier set of aims and objectives than you have if you're building an e-learning course, because ultimately you want your content to be successful, you want it to be sticky, you want people to spend time on the site, and if it's an e-commerce site, then you want people to go off and buy something. If it is your corporate website, then you'll have a whole other set of aims and objectives which you'll measure through analytics, and you'll be able to tweak your strategy, change your sites, and over time incrementally improve it. That's precisely what we can't do with e-learning. But also, if you think about what aims and objectives we set for a course, then if it's a compliance course, that objective is simply we want people to get through to the end of it. and we want maybe some sort of evidence that they've completed some basic training in it, so we might want them to pass an assessment. But overall in this business, completion means you've attained your learning goals for that piece of content. And in the modern age of personalized training, that doesn't seem like quite enough. So, hence Didactics. What it is, it's an analytics service provided by Kineo to help organizations to measure and improve the impact of their digital learning. And I should say that we are still piloting this. It's a prototype at the moment. We're rolling it out with some of our clients. It's something which we're still building and improving and enhancing. So the bits that I'm going to show you are very much phase one of a much bigger software project. The approach we've taken is a little bit different to most of the learning packages, because obviously every single platform, including Totra, has got its own analytics suite attached to it. You can build reports, you can report on what people are doing on the site. Where Didactics is different is it's designed to work alongside a client's existing infrastructure. So we're trying hard to avoid any kind of big platform sale, any high cost to entry. The idea is that this is going to work a bit along the same lines as Google Analytics, for those of you who know what that is and how it works. So it's a separate platform which the e-learning can integrate with. So you can still load it onto your learning management system. It will still track with SCORM if you still want to use that technology. You can still track with XAPI if you've moved on to that. But alongside that, you can also send some learning analytics data over to a system which sits alongside it. And the idea is that there shouldn't actually be any cost at all. If you just want the standard set of reports that you can get out of Didactics, then we'll just plug it into your piece of bespoke content, and it will just be an element of the project with no extra cost attached to it. So once your current LMS, no extra platform stuff to do on it. The data that you get from Didactics is different to SCORM and XAPI, and it's complementary. So with both of those traditional technologies, you're looking at what an individual has done on the course. So you want to find out whether Jez has completed the e-learning, you want to find out what score Jez has got from any assessments in there, and you can find out how long he spent. And if you're being really fancy, you can even find out how he answered the various questions in it. And that's your lot. With Didactics, what we're looking at is how your overall audience are doing. So rather than tracking an individual, you will be able to see that 60% of people got to the end of the course, for instance. And I'll show you the kind of stats and data that you get out of it in a moment. But this is a real crucial key thing. It's not for looking at individual completion or individual engagement. It's looking at engagement across your entire audience. Because we're not tracking individuals, then hopefully it's GDPR friendly. We don't actually store any personal information whatsoever in Didactics. We do have a unique identifier for each user. So again, similar to Google. But unlike Google, we go to great lengths to make sure that we can't actually reverse engineer who that person is. We don't store people data. It's just generic data. And for the most part, it's aggregated data, certainly when it comes back in the reports. It also plugs into other Kineo data services. So as Jez says, data is a whole big picture. And if you want to find out any information about how a course has led to behavioral change, then you'll need to gather lots of data which sits well outside the context of the e-learning, the learning management system, and the individuals involved. But it's an important, basic, fundamental part if you want to do any measurement of impact, is to find out how the course performed, and that's what Didactics is there for. Got a couple of questions coming in. So there is one here from Paul. Hi there, Paul. Good afternoon. How are you doing? We could use control sets pilot groups who are using our spaced repetition app versus others who are not. We then look at the level of first-time passes when each group takes to the end of assessment. So also look at increased sales of products that have been featured in the spaced rep app versus those that are not. Yep, that's exactly the sort of approach which a coherent didactic style approach lends itself to. This is very much the kind of thing which gets Google Analytics gets used for in the wider web worlds, those kind of A/B comparisons between one approach and another approach and see which has the better outcomes. Again, Didactics doesn't allow you to set up the A/B test itself, but there are other tools around which allow you to do that, or you can just manage your groups outside of Didactics. Main thing is that you've got an extra way of measuring useful data for that. Next few slides are the actual results of a test that we ran with. It was a compliance course, I'll be honest. It was a GDPR course. It wasn't the most fascinating subject material going. But this gives you just a quick overview of all of the types of data that you can get from this kind of analytics tool and the sort of information you can glean and how you might want to possibly use it. So first up, just a quick summary of all of the main data points that you get from this course. So again, we're looking at one GDPR course, one set of users, one set of data, and this is actually over a 1 month period. So for our course, we had 732 users making 1,160 attempts at it. So that's an average of 1.6 attempts per user. So classic standard analytics type information. Average attempt duration was 18 minutes. The average time to complete, so if you add up all of those attempts, was 36 minutes. It was designed to be a 45-minute course. So actually that in itself is quite interesting, that people took a little bit less time than expected to run through the course. Incidentally, the course had 2 assessments in it. There was an initial pre-assessment assessment and a post-assessment once people had completed the e-learning. The e-learning wasn't locked, it wasn't compulsory, but the assessment had to be passed for it to be completed. The pass mark was 80%, and people could have as many attempts as they needed to get through it. So 68% of our users managed to get through the course in 1 attempt all the way through, which is quite good going. 32% obviously had to have multiple attempts. The average pre-assessment score was 75%, which is really quite high. So that indicates immediately that we've got an audience who have almost certainly either done a GDPR course before, or they're just generally familiar with the subject matter, which as Kineo was a core component part of the audience is a good thing, and we're very pleased about that. 88% was the average final assessment score. Well, it couldn't have been less than 80% with that many people completing it. So there's still people getting some of the questions wrong. Average final attempts per user was 1.3, which is pretty good actually. That's quite nice and low.
There's a question from Janet. Do you want to pick that up quickly, Pete?
Yes, thank you, Jazz. Yes, so Janet, does Didactics exclude system admin data? We find that our visits skew the data from analytics. It doesn't actually. It shows absolutely all of them. But what we do is make sure that we don't actually start tracking until the moment the course goes live, because the biggest data skew that we get is always from testing. It's from those initial attempts before the main launch. So as long as you've not got a massive sysadmin team, then it should be fine. We have a test course token that we use for pre-launch, and then for the actual final live one, we set it to a production token and just leave that going. So does that cover it, Janet, or do you still fear that you might be skewing the data slightly? I'll let you answer that in the background. Meantime, actually, just to pick up on so next slide, pre versus post assessment. So this underlines the fact that people did pretty well in that pre-assessment. So the blue line up at the top, we see a couple of humps in the pre-assessment, but people doing really quite well at around about the 70, lots of 80%. Got a number of users over here against score across the bottom. There is another hump around about the 50% mark. So this is a separate audience, another clustering of users who are significantly less familiar with the GDPR type course. It does indicate that this could be a good candidate for just allowing people to have a diagnostic at the start of this particular course. So a lot of people are doing well enough to pass it straight away. It seems a bit unfair to have them go through an entire 36-minute course to just when they actually know all of the content first. So you could put this as a reasonable case for people on their second, third, fourth attempts at this. If it's an annual, the sort of course that you have to do annually, there's an argument for just giving them the diagnostic assessment and letting them test out early. So immediately interesting on that. Learner engagement. This is actually one that we're about to change in the dashboard. The blobs were less successful than I'd hope. Engagement on a regular website, or when you look at Google Analytics, is quite a straightforward thing. The longer someone spends on a site, the more engaged they are. That's simply not the case for e-learning, because if someone's spending ages on the course, it could well be that it's not they're engaged, they just don't understand it. Or they might be distracted. They might have the course open, but they're responding to emails at the same time. So it might look like they spent an hour and a half, but they didn't really, because they weren't looking at it for that time. So learner engagement is actually an engaged user is someone who is both spending the right amount of time on a course and also generally answering questions correctly, particularly at the final assessment. Your ideal learner doesn't know that much when they come in. They read everything carefully, they get everything right in the final assessment, and they spend the right amount of time to understand the content. The only way that we can find out what the right amount of time is to compare them with the rest of the audience. So what you want on this graph, which shows duration across the bottom, question accuracy across the top, and the size of the blob is actually the number of users. You want a really nice tight bell curve around about the right amount of duration. The tighter that curve, then the more engaged the audience is and the more competent they are. So this is actually, again, a pretty good audience. Down in the bottom left, we've got the people who clicked in and clicked out again quite quickly, so they're obviously not very engaged. Over at the far right, we've got the people who are taking more than 50 minutes on this course, and again, there's something not quite right there. And there's a fairly biggish group, around about the 45 minutes, which is the amount of time that we thought they should take, but who are getting a lot of questions wrong. And we've got a lot around about the 25 to 30 minutes who are getting everything right, who probably know this too well, and who don't really need to be doing the course. Next up, question effectiveness. This is particularly useful for content creators, so for all the learning designers on the call. This tells you how good a job you've done at writing your questions, or to flip it on its head, how well your audience are understanding the content. This is actually showing the percentage incorrect rather than the percentage correct. And it is showing the green as a pre-assessment, the blue is a post-assessment. So for a well-written question in this course, you want to see a fair number of people getting it wrong at the start, and most people getting it right second time around. So you'll see a good gap between some of these, which indicates a well-written subject on something which is catching people out inside this course, something which is challenging their prior knowledge or their prior expectations. So you see a few of these. So this one is a particularly good one around privacy notices. This one around withdrawing consent is catching out a lot of people at the start. What you don't want to see is questions which are too easy. So ones where the green bar showing percentage incorrect is really low. So there's one that I'm looking at about 3 questions in, where pretty much everyone got that one right first time round. So it's too easy, too obvious. Even worse than that, though, are questions where the bars don't really shift very much, or where a lot of people are still getting those questions wrong second time round. So there's one around who is the data controller, just a little way across to the right, where pretty much everyone got it wrong first time, and still there are about 30% of people getting it wrong second time around. It might be a particularly tricky thing to explain, it might have been badly explained in the course content, or it might simply be a confusingly written question. So it's definitely one to go back and have a look at. Next up, and this is where we actually start to break out of the course content a bit and even start to look slightly higher up the Kirkpatrick scale of what you can actually get out of a course. This is some perspective style questions, some perspective change. So the idea behind this is to measure whether people's thoughts, perspective, attitudes have changed as a result of your artfully and brilliantly written course content. So we can link these two questions up, and they don't have to be the same question. They can be questions around a similar subject, but the idea is the same. You look at what people's perspectives were or expectations were coming into the course, and then you ask them a similar question or a related question at the end and see if you can measure a difference between the two. Again, it's a slightly confusing graph until until you run through it and get used to it. So the example, let's use the example over to the far right. So to what extent are others at the company protective of customer information is the first one of the final two columns. And then the post one, how much more careful do you feel others in the company should be with customer information? So this is artfully worded. It's not asking people whether they're careful with customer data, because some of the other ones show that people automatically say that they are very careful indeed and can't possibly improve on their performance. So instead it's saying, is there a bit of a problem with information security in the organization? Do you think people should do a bit more? And that's managed to elicit a few more fives that actually, fives and fours, the greens and the, I don't know what colour would you say that is? Cyan. It's not cyan, is it? Colours over on this side. So people think that actually there is a bit of an attitudinal problem here, which could do with potentially a bit of a follow-up, maybe some follow-up e-learning, maybe some more questions. So if you ask these questions correctly, if you say, as a result of this course content, is your behavior going to change? What are you going to do differently? Which of the following things are you going to change about your behavior? Then you can put that into your report about course impact. It's no guarantee that someone's going to go off and do what they say they're going to do, but at least it's another measurable data point where you can see some changing attitudes in there. Final one of this set is device use. So looking at which devices people are accessing the course on is always interesting. See whether you need to spend a lot of time designing specifically for mobile users. You can also use this to see if people aren't using mobile devices and you want them to, then you can follow up on that and find out, start to maybe survey them and find out why they don't use their mobiles for e-learning. Equally, you can decide not to worry too much about that. So this is all something which is giving our learning designers and our clients' learning designers a lot more information to deal with, and the ability to do some try out a few experiments, as Paul Westlake suggested earlier, try out some different things and see what kind of measurable impact they have, what kind of improvements they offer in terms of e-learning experience. And this is best seen as a bit of a smorgasbord of different tools and tactics that you can use, with the analytics sitting underneath all of these and underpinning them. So that could be spaced rehearsal techniques, again, as with Paul's app. It could be profiling certain types of learners, so you can see whether you need to maybe run a campaign for particular groups of learners out there to bolster your engagement skills or your engagement numbers. It can also, other tools and techniques which you can use or not use depending on the requirements for the course, so the pre and the post tests, which I've just shown you. The formative questions, the reflective questions around attitude and awareness. You can drop surveys into your courses to see not just how effective people believe the courses to have been, but also to reinforce the information which you think the analytics is giving you. So if you think that someone has rattled through the course because they don't feel it's relevant to them, then you can ask them that specific question at the end of the course, just to reaffirm that you're interpreting the data correctly, or you might find out there's actually something else going on. So that's didactics by way of a quick summary. Jez, you've been looking at the questions coming in. What have I missed?
There's one from Paul again. Is there a school of thought to ask the reflection question at a later date too, to see if attitudes have really changed, or does the data all have to be within the same course?
That is that's a really interesting question, actually, a very astute one, because if you're gathering data across multiple different courses, then we can start to be a bit clever with the kind of questions that you're asking. And so there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't ask a question about a course that a user has taken previously, a completely different course, and just drop that into one of your compliance pieces, and then measure the gap between those responses, because it's all being tracked back in Didactics, it's all being tracked in the same system. You don't have the same SCORM requirement that all tracking must be for that specific course that you've launched. So yeah, absolutely, you can start to ask people questions from at a later date, not just a year later when they have to do the compliance course again, but possibly just 3 months later when they happen to be doing a completely different compliance course. Yes.
Which is great. So thanks for that, Paul. I think it lends us to this next point, which is sort of our model and our thinking around how do we structure data, and how do we use the data that's available to us and our clients to help understand the impact that learning's having. So while Didactics initially looks at immediate results at the core of the model, and it's clearly about learner experience, learner engagement, what we're actually seeing that in terms of their behaviors, we can start to think about the different techniques and different ways to create more longitudinal data sets that give us a wider perspective and a wider understanding around the impact that a particular topic or a particular subject is having or has had. It is, at the end of the day, it is focused on the piece of learning. We're not looking at performance. To get to that performance stage, we would start to need to look at sort of some corroborating data sets to accompany that. So we'd need to look at some other metric. So it could be quite blunt. It could be sales. Apologies for those people that are operating in the sales field, but it could be as clear as, have sales improved as a result of this program? But it may well be a little bit more less clear than that. The metric that we're using may well be less clear. Incident rates, for example, have incidents of X reduced as a result of so and so. So once we start to get into understanding what the metrics are, then we start to think about what different data will do that. So Didactics will give us one level of insight. But ultimately, if we're starting to work towards longer term results, then actually we need to start to think about where and how do we access corroborating data sets that already exist, things that you're maybe already using as an organization, and pulling that in together. So as a business and an organization, we're very much focused on supporting organizations to do that, but with the recognition that it's not easy. And I think that we all understand that actually this whole data thing is quite a challenge. And we're trying to come up with some solutions to help you, and hopefully what we can do is start to have a debate about how do we use data differently, and how do we use the data that exists differently to start to impact and inform the performance that we are having on ultimately on organizational performance. We partner with our partners. The Oxford Group are doing piloting a similar process at the moment, where we're using XAPI data. We're pulling that in from slightly different data sets. We're using SurveyMonkey, for example, and the XAPI data that comes from SurveyMonkey. We're associating that with learner feedback to start to give a more longitudinal picture about changing attitudes and changing understanding around a particular aspect of content or body of knowledge, and how that's having an impact. Again, limited, without some sort of corroborating data, but it's about starting to think, how do we use the technology that we have to support our better understanding of the impact that our learning is having. Deloitte have said 71% of companies view people analytics as a high priority in the organization. But despite that, just 9% say that they have good understanding of the talent dimensions that drive performance, and only 8% they have usable data in the first place. So the key is that are we asking the right question? And then this may well feel like it's a repetitive question and somewhat rhetorical, but are we asking the right questions of the output that we're seeking to get through our learning? If we're not asking the right questions, then it's going to be very difficult to measure the impact that our learning is having if we don't understand particularly what levers, what performance or behavior levers that we're looking at influencing and impacting, and what the result of that will be in black and white terms. So it's a challenging backdrop. we as an organisation are looking at different ways of doing that, and we are very much keen to continue this conversation, this debate. There's a recognition there's no silver bullet, because there isn't one. And I think we probably have to be really clear about that. When it comes to data, and it comes to learning, and it comes to using learning data to support performance, there is no single silver bullet. It's about using the technologies that exist to support us doing that. It's also about building our capability, but equally, I think it's also about building our confidence as a profession, to be able to more comfortably talk about data, to be able to look at data sets, to be able to draw conclusions from that data and articulate the impact that we're having more effectively with other stakeholders within our businesses and organisations. So before we close, is there any questions or anything burning that people have before we say farewell and thank you for your attention this afternoon?
Just to point out that Heracles, thank you. It was teal. That was exactly the colour that I was searching for.
So we'll take the silence in the comment board as no questions, which is great. Oh, one last thing from Paul. If a range of companies are completing similar learning, are you encouraging them to share their data so they have a larger pool to work with? Well, that would be really good. Wouldn't it? To be able for us to start to create some sort of collaborative data. How useful that would be, I don't know. You'd have to look at the data. But knowing how difficult it is for organisations internally to access their own data, and how difficult sometimes the conversation is around getting hold of the right data to impact on learning, actually getting that conversation going within businesses internally themselves might be the first step before we start to think about the bigger picture in terms of collaborating and sharing data. And from Viv, is there an effect that if you do a pre-test and give learners feedback, that this would be improved post-test scores regardless of the learning content? Yeah, I mean, I like it. I think it's how would we do that? How would we create that feedback within a piece of e-learning, potential static piece of e-learning? I'll hand over to Pete, because he probably got some more clever answers to that.
Not at all, actually. My answer is I don't know, but that's exactly the point of having this tool like Didactics. It allows you to posit that kind of question, and then find out whether your hypothesis that it will improve final scores or not is true or not. So it's a way of trying out different things in e-learning, but rather than just going off a feel and a hunch of whether it worked, to a survey of a limited number of users, you can actually see overall if it's had an effect.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Pete, and thank you all again for your attention this afternoon. I hope it's been of interest and some use, and even if those who are self-isolating at this moment in time, it's been a useful use of an hour. So I do appreciate your attention, and please, any questions, email them to us. We're very much in the debate around data, and we'd love to continue that debate beyond this webinar. Thank you very much.